1877, Arizona Territory. An Apache woman stood between two worlds as 100 warriors formed an impenetrable wall around the canyon. No one gets in, no one gets out. She leaned close to the man they were hunting and whispered 3 words that would either save his life or seal both their fates. "I choose you." But why would she risk everything for the one person her people wanted dead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun had already climbed halfway to its zenith when Thomas Caldwell first noticed the dust cloud rising from the eastern ridge. He'd been tracking a wounded mule deer for the better part of 2 hours, moving carefully through the scrub brush and mesquite that dotted the canyon floor. The animal's blood trail had gone cold about 20 minutes back, and Thomas was considering whether to give up the hunt when he saw it. A thin column of dust, too deliberate to be wind, too sustained to be a single rider. He dropped to one knee behind a cluster of prickly pear and squinted against the glare. The dust was moving south, parallel to his position, but still a good mile off. Thomas reached for the battered spyglass in his saddlebag and trained it on the disturbance. What he saw made his blood run cold. Warriors. At least 30 that he could count from this distance, maybe more obscured by the terrain. They moved in a coordinated pattern that spoke of purpose, not random wandering. Apache, certainly. He'd lived in this territory long enough to recognize their riding style, the way they seemed to flow across the landscape rather than simply traverse it. Thomas lowered the spyglass and considered his options. He was 3 days out from Fort Benson, carrying supplies for the winter traders who worked the northern routes. His wagon was hidden in a box canyon about half a mile west, concealed beneath camouflage netting and brush. If he could reach it quietly, slip away before whatever was happening here caught up with him, he might make it back to civilization with his scalp intact. He began moving, keeping low, using every depression in the ground and every scraggly bush for cover. The terrain here was unforgiving, all rock and sand and plants that seemed designed specifically to tear clothing and flesh. Thomas had learned to move through it quietly during his 5 years as a freight hauler, though he'd never claimed to match the almost supernatural stealth of the Apache themselves. The box canyon appeared ahead, its narrow entrance exactly as he'd left it. Thomas quickened his pace, already mentally calculating the fastest route back to the fort. He'd lose the deer entirely and probably have to abandon his plan to resupply the northern traders, but staying alive seemed more important than maintaining his schedule. He was 10 feet from the canyon entrance when he heard the voice. "You move well for a white man." Thomas froze. The voice had come from above and behind him, speaking English with an accent that suggested the speaker had learned the language from missionaries or soldiers. He turned slowly, hands raised to show he was unarmed, and found himself looking up at an Apache woman perched on a boulder like she'd materialized from the rock itself. She couldn't have been more than 25, dressed in traditional buckskin, with intricate beadwork that caught the sunlight. Her dark hair was pulled back and wrapped with red cloth, and she held a rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd been shooting since childhood. But it was her eyes that struck Thomas most forcefully, sharp and intelligent, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under glass. "I don't want trouble," Thomas said carefully. "I'm just passing through." "Passing through where?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "There's nothing in this direction except more desert and the settlements that took our land. I'm heading back to Fort Benson. I'm a freight hauler, not a soldier. I don't fight your people, but you supply the ones who do." It wasn't a question. The woman shifted her position on the boulder, the rifle never wavering from its casual but ready position. "Your wagon is in that canyon. I watched you hide it yesterday." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. She'd been observing him for at least a day, maybe longer, which meant she'd seen everything: where he slept, how he moved, what weapons he carried. He was completely compromised, and the only question now was whether she planned to kill him herself or let the warriors he'd spotted earlier do the job. "My name is Nietzsche," the woman said, seemingly reading something in his expression. "It means mischief maker in your language, though that is not quite accurate. Names rarely translate well. Thomas Caldwell." He wasn't sure why he was given his full name, except that it seemed important somehow to be recognized as a person rather than just another white intruder. Nietzsche nodded slowly. "Thomas Caldwell, who supplies the forts. I know you. The traders speak of a man who keeps his word, who does not cheat them on weight or quality. This is rare among your people. I try to be fair in my dealings." "Fair." Nietzsche seemed to taste the word, finding it oddly flavored. "An interesting choice. Tell me, Thomas Caldwell, do you think it is fair that your forts sit on land where my people hunted for generations? That your soldiers kill our warriors and drive us onto reservations where the soil is poor and the water scarce?" Thomas had no good answer for that. He'd thought about it plenty over the years, lying awake in his bedroll and staring at the stars, but thinking about injustice and actually confronting it face to face were entirely different experiences. "No," he said finally, "I don't think it's fair, but I also don't know how to fix it. At least you do not lie." Nietzsche lowered the rifle slightly, though Thomas noticed she kept her finger near the trigger. "The warriors you saw earlier, they are hunting someone. A man who killed the son of our war chief during a raid 3 weeks ago. They have been tracking him for days, and now they believe he is somewhere in this canyon system." Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place. "And you think I might be that man?" "No." Nietzsche shook her head. "The man they hunt has red hair and a scar across his face from a knife fight in Santa Fe. You do not match that description, but you are here, in the wrong place at a very dangerous time. So, what happens now?" Before Nietzsche could answer, a whistle cut through the air, sharp and brief, unmistakably a signal. The woman's expression shifted slightly, though Thomas couldn't quite read what the change meant. She responded with a whistle of her own, a different pattern, then looked back down at him. "Now you have a choice," she said. "You can run for your wagon and try to escape. The warriors are coming from 3 directions, sealing off this entire area. You might make it if you're very fast and very lucky, though I would not wager much on your chances. Or you trust me." Nietzsche's eyes locked with his, and Thomas saw something there he hadn't expected. Calculation mixed with something that might have been sympathy, or possibly something else entirely. "There is a third path through these canyons, one that my people do not use because it requires climbing skills that most lack. I can guide you through it, get you past the warriors and onto the northern trail that will take you back to your fort. Why would you help me?" "Because you did not lie to me just now when I asked about fairness, because the traders say you keep your word, and because—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Because I am tired of watching everyone I know prepare for wars that only bring more death. Maybe one white man who lives because of an Apache woman's help will remember that mercy is possible. Maybe it will matter someday. Maybe not. Thomas heard voices now, distant but growing closer. The warriors were converging on this area, tightening their net. He had perhaps 2 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. "The third path," he said. "Show me." Naiche dropped from the boulder with surprising grace, landing in a crouch that barely made a sound. Up close, Thomas could see the details of her beadwork, intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story, though he couldn't read the symbols. She moved past him toward the canyon entrance, then paused. "One more thing, Thomas Caldwell. If we are seen together, if any of the warriors spot us before we clear the canyon system, they will assume you have taken me hostage. They will kill you immediately and probably torture you first to make an example. So you will need to stay very quiet and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do this? Yes? Then come and leave your wagon. We will be traveling on foot through passages too narrow for it." Thomas hesitated only a moment before following her into the canyon. Behind him, he could hear the warriors' calls getting clearer, the sound of horses on rock. He'd staked his life on the word of an Apache woman he'd met 5 minutes ago, trusting her to guide him through hostile territory when she had every reason to let him die or kill him herself. The canyon walls rose around them, red stone that had been carved by ancient rivers into fantastic shapes. Naiche moved like water, finding paths through the rock that Thomas would have sworn didn't exist. They climbed up through a narrow chimney where the walls pressed so close together that Thomas had to turn sideways to fit, his pack scraping against stone. At the top of the chimney, they emerged onto a ledge that overlooked the canyon system. Thomas could see the warriors now. They'd split into groups, methodically searching every possible hiding place. There had to be at least 60 of them, maybe more. The scope of the operation made his earlier estimate of 30 seem laughably optimistic. "They are very serious about finding this man," Naiche whispered. "He killed Delgado, the war chief's youngest son, only 17 years old, still learning to be a warrior. The chief's grief has turned to rage, and he will not stop until the killer is found." "Do you know where this man is?" Naiche glanced at him sideways, an unreadable expression on her face. "Perhaps, but that is not your concern. Your concern is surviving the next few hours." They moved along the ledge, Naiche occasionally stopping to listen or to study the terrain below. The sun was directly overhead now, baking the rocks and making the air shimmer with heat. Thomas could feel sweat running down his back, soaking his shirt. He'd left his canteen in the wagon and his mouth was starting to feel like sandpaper. As if reading his thoughts, Naiche produced a small water skin from her belt and handed it back to him. "Drink, but not too much. We have a long way to go." The water was warm but clean, tasting faintly of leather. Thomas took 2 small swallows and handed it back. "Thank you. Save your thanks until we are clear of this place." They continued for another hour, following a route that seemed to exist more in Naiche's mind than in any visible reality. They climbed, descended, traversed ledges barely wide enough for their feet, and squeezed through gaps in the rock that made Thomas's heart hammer with claustrophobia. Through it all, Naiche moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating, never second-guessing her path. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally reached what appeared to be a dead end, a sheer cliff face with no visible way forward. Thomas looked around, confused, then watched as Naiche approached what looked like a solid wall of rock. She pressed her hand against a particular spot, and a section of the wall pivoted slightly, revealing a passage so narrow and dark that it looked more like a crack in reality than an actual path. "Through here," she said. "It will be dark for a while, but the passage is straight. Keep one hand on the wall to your right and walk carefully. The floor is uneven. You've used this route before. When I was younger, before the wars became so intense, my grandmother showed it to me. She said it was an escape route, a way to flee if our camp was ever attacked. I never thought I would use it to save a white man." They entered the darkness, and Thomas lost all sense of direction. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding through solid rock in a way that defied his understanding of geology. He could hear Nietzsche's breathing ahead of him, steady and calm, and he focused on that sound to keep from panicking in the absolute blackness. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he saw a light ahead, a growing brightness that resolved into the opening of the passage. They emerged on the far side of the canyon system, with miles of open desert stretching before them and no sign of the pursuing warriors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Nietzsche turned to face him, and for the first time since they'd met, she smiled slightly. "You did well, Thomas Caldwell. Many white men would have panicked in the dark passage. You kept your head. I've learned that panicking doesn't help much in dangerous situations. A useful lesson." She pointed northwest toward a range of low hills barely visible on the horizon. "That direction will take you back to the northern trail. Follow the hills until you see a distinctive rock formation that looks like a bird's head, then turn west. You should reach the trail by tomorrow evening if you maintain a good pace." "You're not coming with me?" "No, I have my own path to follow." She studied him for a long moment, and Thomas had the distinct impression she was deciding something important. "Thomas Caldwell, I need you to make me a promise." "What kind of promise?" "What I'm about to tell you will put both of us in danger if you speak of it. But I think you deserve to know the truth because you trusted me when you had no reason to do so." She took a breath. "The man the warriors are hunting, the one with red hair and the scar, is hiding in a cave on the eastern edge of the canyon system. I know this because I have been tracking him too, for different reasons than the warriors. He killed Delgado, yes, but he also saved my life 3 years ago during a flood. He pulled me from a river when I would have drowned. I owe him a debt." Thomas felt his mind racing. "So you're going to help him escape too?" "I am going to try, but there are more than 100 warriors searching for him now, and they have blocked every normal route out of the canyon system. The path I just showed you is the only way, and I cannot guide him through it without being seen. The warriors know I was in this area. They will be looking for me soon, wondering why I did not respond to their calls. If they find me with him, they will assume I am a traitor to my people. What do you need from me?" Nietzsche's eyes locked with his again, and Thomas saw the weight of what she was about to ask. "I need you to create a distraction, something that will draw the warrior's attention away from the eastern caves for long enough that I can get him to the passage. A fire, perhaps, or some other commotion that will make them think he is somewhere else. They'll kill me if they catch me. Yes, which is why this is a promise I can only ask you to consider, not demand. You owe me nothing, Thomas Caldwell. I helped you because I chose to, not because I expected payment. But this man, his name is Marcus Brennan, and he is running from a past that haunts him as much as the warriors do. He deserves a chance at life, even if his choices have been poor ones." Thomas looked out across the desert, thinking about the wagon he'd left behind, the supplies that would be lost, the comfortable life he'd built as a freight hauler who stayed out of other people's conflicts. Then he thought about the calm certainty in Nietzsche's voice when she'd led him through the dark passage, the trust she'd extended without hesitation. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do," he said. The plan Nietzsche outlined was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Thomas would circle back around the southern edge of the canyon system, staying well outside the warriors' search perimeter. Once in position near the western cliffs, the opposite side from where Marcus Brennan was hiding, he would set fire to a dense patch of dried brush and abandoned timber that sat in a natural bowl of rock. The smoke would be visible for miles, and the warriors would assume their quarry was trying to create cover for an escape attempt in that direction. "How long will it take you to reach Brennan once they move?" Thomas asked, already mentally mapping the route Nietzsche had described. 15 minutes if I run fast, another 10 to get him to the passage entrance. After that, we need perhaps 30 minutes to navigate the dark section. She traced lines in the dust with her finger, showing him the layout. The fire needs to burn long enough and hot enough that they commit fully to investigating it. If they realize it's a diversion too quickly, they will return before we clear the passage. So, I need to keep it going for at least an hour. Yes, and you need to make sure they see movement near the fire. They must believe someone is there, trying to use the smoke as cover. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding the full scope of what she was asking. He wouldn't just be lighting a fire and running. He'd have to stay in the area, visible enough to draw attention but mobile enough to avoid capture. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse with warriors who knew this terrain far better than he ever would. "There's something else you should know," Nietzsche said, her voice dropping lower. "The war chief leading this hunt. His name is Cocheta. He is Delgado's father, and his grief has made him ruthless. He has given orders that the red-haired man should be taken alive so that he can be made to suffer before he dies. But anyone helping the red-haired man will be killed immediately. No capture, no questions. Do you understand what this means? It means if they figure out what I'm doing, I won't have a chance to surrender." "Exactly." Nietzsche's expression was grave. "I need you to understand the full weight of what I am asking. This is not a small favor between strangers. This is asking you to risk everything for a man you have never met, because I once made a promise to him. You can say no, Thomas Caldwell. I will think no less of you for choosing to live." Thomas looked back toward the canyon system, though from this angle he could only see the tops of the rock formations silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Somewhere in those twisting passages, a man named Marcus Brennan was probably running out of water and hope, waiting for death to find him. And somewhere else in those same passages, more than 100 warriors were methodically closing every exit, driven by grief and the need for vengeance. He thought about the life he'd built in Arizona Territory. Modest but honest, profitable but not greedy. He'd spent 5 years establishing himself as a man who kept his word, who dealt fairly with everyone regardless of which side of the various conflicts they found themselves on. That reputation was valuable, maybe the most valuable thing he owned. But what good was a reputation for fairness if he wasn't willing to act on it when the cost got high? "I'll do it," he said, "but I need something from you in return." Nietzsche raised an eyebrow. "You are in a position to bargain?" "Not bargain, just ask. If I don't make it out of this, I need you to get word to a woman named Sarah Dutton at Fort Benson. She runs a general store there. Tell her what happened, and tell her she was right about me needing to pick a side eventually. She'll understand." Something flickered across Nietzsche's face. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Sarah Dutton, the woman with yellow hair who argues with the soldiers about their treatment of Apache prisoners. "You know her?" "I know of her. She is brave for a white woman, or perhaps foolish. The line between the two is often thin." Nietzsche studied him with renewed interest. "This woman means something to you. She's a friend, a good one, and she's been telling me for 2 years that neutrality is an illusion, that eventually everyone has to choose what they stand for. I always told her I stood for fair dealing and staying out of trouble. And now? Now I'm about to set fire to a canyon and play decoy for Apache warriors. I guess she wins the argument." Nietzsche almost smiled at that, then grew serious again. "I will tell her if it comes to that. But do your best to survive, Thomas Caldwell. The territory needs more men who keep their word, even when it costs them." They separated then, Nietzsche moving back toward the canyon entrance with the fluid grace he'd noticed before, Thomas beginning his wide circle toward the western cliffs. The sun was past its peak now, beginning the long slide toward evening that would end with another freezing desert night. Thomas tried not to think about the fact that he was walking away from safety and toward danger by choice. Tried not to calculate the odds of him seeing tomorrow's sunrise. The terrain was brutal, all loose rock and thorny vegetation that grabbed at his clothes. He kept low, using every bit of cover available, moving slowly enough to avoid kicking up dust that might be visible from a distance. Twice he spotted groups of warriors in the distance and had to freeze in place, barely breathing until they moved on. The Apache were thorough in their search, leaving nothing to chance. It took him nearly 3 hours to reach the western cliffs, moving in a wide arc that kept him outside the search perimeter. By the time he found the dense brush Nietzsche had described, the sun was touching the horizon, and the light was beginning to fade toward that peculiar gold color that desert evenings were known for. The timber she'd mentioned was there too, abandoned remnants from some long-ago attempt at construction, now dried to tinder by years of sun and wind. Thomas studied the setup, planning his fire. The rock bowl would contain the flames and intensify them, sending a thick column of smoke straight up into the still air. There was enough fuel here to burn for hours if he managed it correctly. The trick would be getting it started hot enough to create immediate smoke, while also ensuring he could keep feeding it without exposing himself too much. He gathered additional brush and wood, piling it strategically around the main fuel source. Then he pulled out his flint and steel, said a brief prayer to whatever might be listening, and struck the first spark. The tinder caught immediately, hungry for flame. Thomas fed it carefully, building the fire from a small flicker to a roaring blaze that sent heat washing over him in waves. The smoke began to rise, thick and black from the green wood mixed in with the dry, exactly the kind of signal that would be visible from anywhere in the canyon system. Now came the dangerous part. Thomas moved away from the fire to a position behind a cluster of boulders that offered both cover and a view of the approaches. He gathered several fist-sized rocks, weighing them in his hand. Then he threw one hard at a patch of loose scree on the far side of the fire bowl, creating a clatter that would sound like someone moving quickly over rock. The response was almost immediate. A whistle cut through the air from the east, answered by 2 more from different directions. They'd seen the smoke, and now they'd heard the noise. The trap was set. Thomas threw another rock, this time aiming for a different area. He varied the timing and location, creating the impression of someone moving erratically around the fire, perhaps gathering more fuel or trying to navigate the rough terrain. It was exhausting work, requiring him to shift position constantly to maintain the illusion while staying behind cover. The first warriors appeared within 10 minutes, materializing from the desert like they'd been formed from the rock itself. Thomas counted 8 of them, spreading out to surround the fire from multiple directions. They moved with practiced coordination, clearly experienced in this kind of pursuit. One of them, a tall man with distinctive white streaks in his hair, seemed to be giving orders with hand signals. Thomas threw another rock, making sure this one was visible in the firelight as it arced through the air. The warriors converged on that position immediately, weapons ready. When they found nothing there, the tall warrior began shouting orders that Thomas couldn't understand, but could certainly interpret. They were spreading out further, searching more carefully. More warriors arrived, called by whistles and signals. Thomas counted 20, then 30, then stopped counting as the numbers grew too large. The diversion was working. Nietzsche had said they would commit fully if they believed their quarry was here, and she'd been right. The western cliffs were now swarming with searchers, all of them focused on finding the man they believed was hiding among these rocks. The problem was that Thomas was actually hiding among these rocks, and the search net was tightening around his position with alarming efficiency. He stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, as warriors passed within yards of his boulder cluster. The firelight created dancing shadows that helped conceal him, but it also meant that any movement would be instantly visible. He was committed now. Moving would reveal his position, but staying here would eventually result in discovery as the search grew more thorough. The sun had fully set now, leaving only the fire and the emerging stars for light. Thomas used the darkness to shift position slightly, move into a different set of boulders that offered a narrow gap he might be able to squeeze through if he needed to run. As he moved, he heard voices approaching. 2 warriors talking in low tones, their words in Apache, but their intent clear from the way they were probing every shadow with their rifles. Thomas pressed himself against the rock, making himself as small as possible. The warriors were so close he could hear their breathing, could smell the leather and smoke that clung to their clothing. One of them stopped directly on the other side of his boulder, close enough that Thomas could have reached out and touched him if he'd been suicidal enough to try. Then the warrior spoke, and Thomas's blood ran ice cold. The man was speaking English, clearly communicating with someone who'd just arrived. "Nothing here, Cocheta. Whoever set this fire is long gone, or they're a ghost." Cocheta. The war chief himself had come to investigate the diversion. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the response. Not a ghost. The voice was older, roughened by decades of desert wind and warfare. The fire is too well maintained to be abandoned. Someone is feeding it, which means someone is here. Spread the search wider. Check every rock, every shadow. I want this area stripped clean. More warriors arrived, their numbers now overwhelming. Thomas realized with sinking certainty that he'd succeeded too well in his diversion. Instead of drawing a portion of the warriors away from the eastern caves, he'd attracted what seemed like the entire hunting party, which meant Nietzsche and Marcus Brennan should have more than enough time to reach the passage and escape. It also meant Thomas's own chances of survival had just dropped to nearly 0. He waited until the voices moved slightly away, then began to ease, backward through the narrow gap he'd identified earlier. It led deeper into the rock formation, into a maze of stone that offered both cover and the very real possibility of becoming trapped. But staying where he was guaranteed discovery, so he took the only option available. The gap opened into a small chamber, barely large enough for him to crouch in. Thomas felt his way around the space, discovering that it had two exits aside from the one he'd entered through, one that seemed to lead upward into the rock formation, and another that dropped away into darkness that might be a descent or might be a sheer cliff. Neither option was appealing, but the upward path seemed marginally less likely to result in immediate death. He started climbing, using his hands to feel for holds in the darkness. The rock was rough and solid, offering good grip despite the blackness. He climbed for what felt like an eternity, his arms burning with effort, until he finally emerged onto a ledge that overlooked the entire western cliff area. From this vantage point, he could see the full scope of the search below. There had to be 70 or 80 warriors down there, systematically checking every possible hiding spot. The fire he'd set was burning lower now, no longer being fed, and in its fading light, the warriors looked like shadows themselves, dark figures moving with lethal purpose through darker landscape. Thomas allowed himself a moment to catch his breath and assess his situation. He was trapped on a ledge with no obvious way down except back the way he'd come, which would put him directly into the search pattern below. The warriors would eventually expand their search upward, would eventually find this ledge and anyone on it. He had perhaps an hour before that happened, maybe less, but an hour might be enough. Nietzsche and Marcus Brennan had now had well over an hour to reach the passage. If they'd moved fast, if they hadn't encountered any problems, they should be through the dark section and emerging on the far side. They should be safe. Thomas found himself hoping that was true, that his decision to help a stranger based on the word of another stranger would at least result in someone surviving this night. He thought about Sarah Dutton back at Fort Benson, about how she'd warned him that neutrality was impossible in a land where people were killing each other over whose claim to the territory was more legitimate. He thought about how he'd always believed that staying out of conflicts was the same as being fair to everyone involved. He'd been wrong about that. Sometimes fairness meant choosing a side, even when the choice could kill you. A whistle sounded from below, 3 sharp notes in quick succession. Thomas recognized it as a signal, though he didn't know what it meant. The warriors began moving in a new pattern, converging on something or someone in the rocks below his position. He strained to see what they'd found, his heart hammering with the fear that somehow Nietzsche had been discovered, that the whole plan had collapsed. Then he saw movement in the firelight, a figure being dragged forward by 2 warriors. The figure was fighting, trying to break free, but the warriors held firm. They brought their captive before the tall warrior with white-streaked hair, the one Thomas had identified as giving orders earlier. But it wasn't Marcus Brennan they'd caught. It wasn't even a man. It was Nietzsche. The war chief, Cocheta, approached her slowly, his posture radiating fury. Thomas was too far away to hear what was being said, but he could read the confrontation in their body language. Cocheta was demanding answers, and Nietzsche was refusing to give them. Even from this distance, even in the failing light, Thomas could see the defiance in the way she held herself. Then Cocheta raised his hand and struck her across the face, hard enough that she fell to her knees. 2 warriors hauled her back upright, holding her in place while Cocheta continued his interrogation. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. The plan had failed. Somehow, despite everything, Nietzsche had been caught, which meant Marcus Brennan was probably captured or dead as well, and the whole desperate gambit had accomplished nothing except to ensure that everyone involved would pay the price. He watched helplessly as the scene unfolded below. knowing there was nothing he could do, knowing that revealing himself now would only add one more body to whatever carnage was coming. All he could do was witness and remember, and hope that somehow Sarah Dutton would learn what had happened here and understand why he'd made the choices he'd made. But then something unexpected happened. Naiche looked up toward the ledge where Thomas was hidden, her eyes seeming to find him despite the darkness and the distance. And she smiled. Not a happy smile, but one of grim satisfaction. The expression of someone who'd accomplished exactly what they'd set out to do, even if it cost them everything. In that moment, Thomas understood. She'd been caught deliberately. She'd led them to her on purpose, drawing their attention and their rage to herself and away from something else. Away from someone else. The diversion within the diversion. The sacrifice play that would give Marcus Brennan the time he needed to clear the passage and reach safety, even if it meant Naiche herself would face whatever punishment Cocheta had in mind for traitors to their people. Thomas watched as they bound her hands and began leading her away from the western cliffs, back toward the main canyon system. The warriors were following. Their search of this area apparently concluded now that they'd found what they believed was the real prize. Not the man they'd been hunting, but the woman who'd helped him escape. As the last of them disappeared into the desert darkness, Thomas finally allowed himself to move. His arms were shaking from more than just the climb, and his mind was racing with implications he was only beginning to understand. Naiche had said she needed him to create a distraction. She'd never mentioned that she would be creating an even bigger one. She'd never said that her plan involved sacrificing herself to ensure Marcus Brennan's escape. She'd simply asked Thomas to trust her, and he had, and now she was being dragged away to face consequences that would likely end with her death. The fire below had burned down to embers, no longer providing enough light to see by. Thomas began the careful descent from his ledge, moving by feel and memory, knowing that he had to get away from this area before the warriors decided to return and conduct a more thorough search. But as he climbed down through the darkness, one thought kept circling through his mind, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored. He'd started this day as a freight hauler trying to avoid trouble, trying to maintain his profitable neutrality in a land at war with itself. He'd end it as something else entirely. A man who'd helped an Apache woman save a fugitive, who'd witnessed her capture and done nothing to stop it, who now carried the knowledge of her sacrifice like a brand burned into his soul. The question was what he did with that knowledge. Whether he honored her sacrifice by staying silent and staying alive, or whether he tried to do something about it, even though any action would likely be suicidal and pointless. Thomas reached the bottom of the rock formation and started walking north, toward the distant hills and the trail that would take him back to Fort Benson. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted by decisions not yet made and obligations not yet fulfilled. Behind him, the dying embers of his fire cast faint shadows across the desert floor, slowly fading into darkness as if they'd never been there at all. Thomas walked through the desert night for 3 hours before his conscience finally stopped him. He'd covered good ground, put in miles between himself and the western cliffs, following the terrain that would eventually lead him back to the northern trail in safety. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear air, casting just enough light to navigate by, and the temperature had dropped to that bone-chilling cold that high desert nights were infamous for. He should have kept walking. Every rational calculation told him that continuing north was the only sensible choice. Naiche had made her decision knowing the consequences. had orchestrated her own capture to complete a mission she'd committed to years ago when Marcus Brennan pulled her from a flooding river. Her sacrifice would be meaningless if Thomas threw his life away trying to undo it. But rationality wasn't the only voice in his head anymore. He stopped walking and turned to look back south, toward the canyon system that was now invisible in the darkness. Somewhere in that direction, Naicha was being held by warriors who believed she'd betrayed them. Cocheta would want answers. Where was the red-haired man who helped him escape? What other treachery had she been involved in? And when she refused to answer, because Thomas was certain she would refuse, the interrogation would become something far worse. Sarah Dutton's words echoed in his memory. Eventually, everyone has to choose what they stand for. He'd chosen once already tonight, when he agreed to create the diversion. But that choice had been made in ignorance of the full cost, without understanding that Nietzsche planned to pay the highest price herself. Now he had all the information, could see the full picture of what his involvement had set in motion, and he had to choose again. Stay silent and safe, or speak up and die trying to make things right. Thomas sat down on a flat rock and forced himself to think it through methodically, the way he approached any difficult business decision. What were his assets? He knew the terrain around the canyon system better than he had this morning, having just navigated it extensively. He knew the warriors were focused on interrogating Nietzsche, which meant their search protocols might be relaxed. He had his rifle, his knife, and enough ammunition for perhaps 20 shots if he was careful. What were his liabilities? He was one man against at least 80 warriors who knew this land like their own skin. He had no real combat experience beyond the occasional bar fight. He didn't speak Apache and couldn't blend in even if he wanted to. His odds of successfully rescuing Naicha were so low as to be essentially non-existent. But there was a third category he hadn't considered until now. What did honor require of him? Nietzsche had saved his life first, guiding him through the secret passage when she could have left him to be discovered by the search parties. Then she'd asked for his help saving Marcus Brennan, but she'd made it clear he could refuse without judgment. When he'd agreed, she'd never mentioned that her plan involved sacrificing herself. She'd protected him from that knowledge, had prevented him from trying to talk her out of it or offering some alternative. She'd done all of that, and now she was paying the price for trusting that he would honor their agreement and walk away. Except walking away felt like betrayal, felt like taking everything she'd given and offering nothing in return except his survival. Thomas stood up and started walking again, but this time he was heading south, back toward the canyons, back toward certain death if he was caught, but also back toward the only decision that let him sleep at night if he somehow survived. He had no plan beyond getting close enough to assess the situation. Maybe he'd find that rescue was truly impossible, and he'd have to content himself with witnessing and remembering. Maybe he'd find an opportunity so slim it barely qualified as a chance. Or maybe he'd just die quickly and clean up the loose ends of this whole mess. Any of those outcomes felt more honest than walking away. The canyon system appeared on the southern horizon as the first gray light of dawn began to break. Thomas approached carefully, using every skill he'd learned from 5 years of traveling dangerous territory. The warriors would have posted sentries, would be watching for any sign of the red-haired man attempting a rescue of the woman who'd helped him. They wouldn't be expecting a freight hauler who should be halfway to Fort Benson by now. Thomas circled wide around the main canyon entrances, looking for the back approaches that Naicha had shown him yesterday. The terrain was familiar now, which helped, but it also meant he understood exactly how exposed he was during the approach. Any sentry with decent eyesight could spot him if they were looking in the right direction. He found a position on a ridge that overlooked what appeared to be the main Apache camp, a cluster of temporary shelters set up in a protected area where 3 canyons intersected. Smoke rose from several fires, and Thomas could see figures moving between the shelters. He counted at least 40 warriors visible, which meant there were probably twice that many in total once he accounted for the ones out on patrol or sleeping. And there, tied to a pole near the largest shelter, was Naicha. Even from this distance, Thomas could see she'd been beaten. Her face was swollen, and she was slumped against the pole in a way that suggested either exhaustion or unconsciousness. 2 guards stood nearby, but they seemed more focused on their conversation than on watching their prisoner. Why would they be alert? Where could she possibly go, bound hand and foot in the middle of a camp full of warriors? Thomas studied the camp layout, trying to identify patterns in the way people moved through it. There was a main path that most traffic followed, leading from the shelters to a water source somewhere deeper in the canyon. The guards rotated every few hours based on the patterns he observed, and there were gaps in coverage during the rotation when positions were unmanned for brief periods. But even identifying those weaknesses didn't change the fundamental problem. He was one man with no reasonable way to free a prisoner from the center of a hostile camp and escape without being caught or killed. He needed help or a miracle, preferably both. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, Thomas watched the camp activity increase. Warriors came and went, some leaving on what looked like patrol routes while others returned from night duty. The camp had the organized feel of a military operation, which made sense, given that Cocheta was a war chief with decades of experience leading his people in conflicts with both rival tribes and white settlers. Around midday, there was a change in the camp's energy. Warriors began gathering near the central fire, forming a rough circle. Naicha was dragged from the pole and brought to the center of the circle. Forced to her knees, Cocheta emerged from the large shelter, and even from a distance Thomas could read the fury in his posture. The war chief began speaking, his voice carrying across the canyon in a language Thomas didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. This was a trial, or perhaps a sentencing. Naicha was being held accountable for her actions, and the assembled warriors were there to witness justice being done according to their customs and laws. Thomas watched helplessly as Cocheta's speech grew more heated, his gestures more emphatic. Several other warriors spoke as well, some seeming to argue, while others nodded agreement with whatever was being said. Through it all, Naicha remained kneeling, her head raised, her posture defiant, despite the obvious pain she was in. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman emerged from one of the shelters and pushed through the circle of warriors to stand beside Naicha. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but the warriors parted for her with obvious respect. She began speaking to Cocheta, and whatever she said made the war chief pause in his denunciation. The argument that followed was intense, even though Thomas couldn't understand a word of it. The old woman was clearly advocating for Naicha, while Cocheta was just as clearly opposed to any mercy. Other voices joined in, the camp dividing into factions right before Thomas's eyes. Some supported the old woman's position, others sided with Cocheta, and the debate grew heated enough that Thomas worried it might turn violent. Finally, Cocheta made a gesture that silenced everyone. He spoke for several minutes, then pointed at Naicha and made a declarative statement that ended the discussion. The old woman looked devastated. Several warriors looked satisfied, and Nietzsche herself showed no reaction at all. The circle dispersed, warriors returning to their various duties. Nietzsche was dragged back to the pole and retied, but Thomas noticed the guards had been doubled from 2 to 4. Whatever Cocheta had decided, it had clearly increased the security around their prisoner. Thomas settled in to watch and wait, knowing he needed more information before he could even consider attempting anything. As the afternoon wore on, he observed the guard rotation patterns more carefully, noting which warriors seemed more alert and which were clearly just going through the motions. He studied the terrain around the camp, identifying possible approach routes and escape paths. As evening approached, the old woman who'd spoken up during the trial emerged from her shelter again and approached Nietzsche's guards. There was a brief conversation, then the woman was allowed to approach the prisoner. She knelt beside Nietzsche, offering her water from a leather pouch and speaking quietly. Thomas wished desperately that he could hear what was being said. The old woman's body language suggested comfort and reassurance, while Nietzsche's responses, when she made them, seemed weary but grateful. After about 10 minutes, the old woman stood, touched Nietzsche's face gently, and walked away. Thomas saw her wipe tears from her eyes as she returned to her shelter. As darkness fell, the camp settled into its evening routine. Fires were built up for cooking, and the smell of food drifted on the wind. Warriors gathered in small groups, some eating, some maintaining weapons, some simply talking. The 4 guards around Nietzsche remained alert, rotating position every hour to ensure no one got complacent. Thomas knew he was running out of time. Whatever Cocheta had decided during the trial, it would likely be carried out soon. Possibly at dawn, which was the traditional time for executions in many cultures. He had perhaps 12 hours to figure out how to do the impossible, or to accept that some things couldn't be fixed no matter how much you wanted to fix them. He was considering his limited options when he heard a sound behind him, the soft scrape of leather on rock that meant someone was approaching his position. Thomas froze, his hand moving slowly toward his rifle, calculating whether he could turn and fire before whoever was behind him could react. "Don't move, freight hauler." The voice was male, speaking English with an accent that suggested someone who'd learned the language from multiple sources. "You are covered by 3 rifles. You turn around, you die. You reach for your weapon, you die. You understand?" "I understand." Thomas kept his hands visible, his body still. "I'm not looking for a fight." "No? Then what are you doing watching our camp from this ridge? Admiring the sunset?" "I came back for the woman. Nietzsche. She doesn't deserve what's happening to her." There was a pause, then footsteps as the speaker moved around to where Thomas could see him. The man was in his 40s, weathered by sun and wind, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. He held his rifle casually but confidently, and Thomas had no doubt he could use it with lethal efficiency if needed. "You came back," the man repeated, his tone suggesting he was testing the truth of the statement. "The white man who set the fire as a diversion. You could be safely away from here, back to your fort and your comfortable life. Instead, you come back to die for a woman you met yesterday. This makes no sense to me." "It doesn't make much sense to me either," Thomas admitted, "but she saved my life, and then she sacrificed herself to complete a mission I helped her with. Walking away felt like betrayal." The scarred man studied him for a long moment. "My name is Taza. I am Nietzsche's brother, though we share only a mother. not a father. I was one of those arguing for her life during the trial today. I did not succeed in convincing Cocheta to show mercy. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What did he decide? She will be killed at dawn. Not quickly. Cocheta wants her to suffer for betraying her people. He sees her actions as personal betrayal, because his son is dead and she helped the man responsible escape. Grief has made him cruel. Taza's expression was grim. The old woman you saw speaking with Nietzsche, that was our mother. She pleaded for exile instead of death, but Cocheta refused. He says examples must be made. So, you're here to kill me before I can try anything stupid. Actually, Taza said slowly, lowering his rifle slightly, I'm here because I watched you all afternoon. I saw you studying the camp, trying to find a way to free her. I saw you stay when you should have left, return when you should have fled. And I think perhaps you are a man who keeps his word, even when it costs him everything. Thomas didn't know where this was going, but he sensed a shift in the conversation. Your point? My point is that I cannot save my sister. If I try, Cocheta will kill us both, and possibly our mother as well. He is looking for any excuse to eliminate anyone who might question his authority. But you are not one of us. You are an outsider who owes nothing to Cocheta or our laws. If you were to attempt a rescue and somehow succeed, it would shame Cocheta, but it would not be treason from one of his own people. You want me to try rescuing her? I want my sister to live. If that means a crazy white man attempts something impossible and somehow pulls it off, then yes, that is what I want. Taza reached into his belt and pulled out a knife, offering it handle first to Thomas. This belonged to Delgado, Cocheta's son. It was taken from the red-haired man's camp when we first began tracking him, evidence that the killing happened. If you free Nietzsche, give this to her. She'll understand what it means. Thomas took the knife, feeling the weight of it in his hand. What does it mean? It means that Delgado's death has been avenged in ways Cocheta does not understand. The red-haired man took his life, yes, but Nietzsche ensured the red-haired man escaped, which means Delgado's killer goes free, while Delgado's father descends into the kind of cruelty that dishonors his son's memory. Sometimes the greatest revenge is allowing people to become the thing they hate most. Taza's smile was bitter. Give her the knife, and she will know that her brother understands and approves of what she did. This doesn't make sense. Why would you approve of her helping your chief's son's killer escape? Because I knew Delgado. He was young and stupid and eager to prove himself a warrior. He attacked the red-haired man's camp without authorization, seeking glory. The man defended himself, as anyone would. Delgado's death was tragedy, not murder, but Cocheta cannot see this through his grief. Taza met Thomas's eyes. My sister understood that killing the red-haired man would not bring Delgado back, would not make anything better. She chose mercy over vengeance. For this, she will die at dawn unless someone prevents it. Thomas looked down at the knife in his hand, then back at the camp below where Nietzsche remained tied to the pole, guarded by 4 warriors who would kill anyone attempting rescue. The impossibility of the situation hadn't changed, but now he had something he didn't have before, an ally and information about what the knife meant. The guards rotate at midnight, Taza said quietly. For 3 minutes, the east approach is unwatched while the new guards move into position. The ropes binding her are standard. Sharp knife cuts through them in seconds. After that, you're on your own. I cannot help you escape without revealing my involvement. 3 minutes to cut her free and get clear of the camp. Impossible, I know, but less impossible than what you were planning before." Taza turned to leave, then paused. "Thomas Caldwell. That is your name, yes? My sister spoke of you before the trial. She said you were a man who kept his word even when the cost was high. She said if she had to choose someone to trust with her life, she would choose you. I think perhaps she was right." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he'd arrived, leaving Thomas alone on the ridge with a borrowed knife and a 3-minute window to attempt the impossible. Thomas spent the hours until midnight preparing for 3 minutes that would determine whether he and Naiche lived or died. He moved down from the ridge to a position closer to the camp, finding a depression in the ground about 50 yards from where Naiche was tied. From here, he could see the guard positions clearly and time their movements with precision. The east approach that Taza had mentioned was a narrow gap between two shelters, partially obscured by shadows from the nearby fires. During the guard rotation, the warriors leaving their posts would exit through the west side while the replacements approached from the south. For exactly 3 minutes, that eastern gap would be unwatched, not because of poor planning, but because the Apache simply had more area to secure than they had warriors to deploy simultaneously. Thomas checked his equipment methodically. The knife Taza had given him was sharp and well-balanced, perfect for cutting rope quickly. His rifle was loaded but would be useless in a stealth operation. Firing it would alert the entire camp and get them both killed within seconds. He had his own belt knife as backup, and a small pouch of dried meat that wouldn't help with the escape but might keep them alive if they managed to get away. The camp was settling into its night routine. Most warriors had retired to their shelters, leaving only the guards and a few men sitting around the central fire talking in low voices. Nache appeared to be unconscious or asleep, her head drooped forward against the pole. Thomas hoped she had enough strength left to run when the time came. At 11:30, Thomas began his approach. He moved slowly, using the darkness and the uneven terrain to mask his movement. Every few feet he would freeze and listen, ensuring no one had detected his presence. The camp dogs were the biggest risk. They'd been barking on and off all evening, but so far none had caught his scent or sound. He reached the depression he'd identified as his staging point with 20 minutes to spare. From here, he was close enough to reach Naiche in seconds once the window opened, but far enough away that casual observation wouldn't spot him. He settled in to wait, controlling his breathing, trying to keep his heart rate down despite the adrenaline flooding his system. At 11:50, the current guards began showing signs of readiness for rotation. One of them stretched, another checked his rifle, small movements that indicated the shift change was approaching. Thomas tensed. Every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Midnight arrived with no fanfare, just the quiet exchange as 4 warriors left their posts and 4 more began moving into position. Thomas counted in his head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and started moving on 3. He covered the 50 yards in a low crouch, moving as fast as he dared while staying below the sight lines of the few warriors still awake in the camp. 30 seconds gone. He reached the eastern gap and slipped through it, pressing himself against the wall of a shelter while he verified no one had seen him. The camp remained quiet except for the low conversation from the central fire, the speakers facing away from his position. 45 seconds. Thomas moved toward Naiche, the knife already in his hand. She was still slumped against the pole, and for one terrible moment he thought she might actually be dead, that Cocheta had decided not to wait until dawn after all. Then her eyes opened, widening with shock as she recognized him. He pressed a finger to his lips urgently, then began sawing at the ropes binding her wrists. The knife was sharp, and the rope was standard braided leather, exactly as Taza had promised. The strands parted quickly, and Naicha's hands came free. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Thomas moved to her ankles, cutting those bonds with the quick, efficient strokes. Naiche was struggling to stand, her legs clearly cramped from hours of being bound. He grabbed her arm to steady her, and she leaned on him heavily. "Can you run?" he whispered urgently. "I can try," she whispered back, her voice rough from thirst and abuse. 1 minute, 40 seconds. They moved toward the eastern gap, Naiche limping badly but moving as fast as she could manage. Thomas kept one hand on her elbow, supporting her while simultaneously scanning for threats. They were almost to the gap when he heard a shout from behind them. One of the guards had returned early from rotation and spotted the empty pole where a prisoner should have been tied. His cry of alarm brought immediate response from throughout the camp. Warriors emerging from shelters, weapons being grabbed, the organized chaos of a military unit responding to a breach. "Run!" Thomas pushed Naiche ahead of him through the gap and followed close behind. The 3-minute window had collapsed to nothing, and now they were simply fleeing for their lives with an entire camp of Apache warriors mobilizing to pursue them. They ran east into the darkness, Naicha stumbling occasionally but keeping pace through sheer will. Behind them, Thomas could hear the sounds of pursuit organizing, shouted orders, warriors mounting horses, the camp transforming into a hunting party with terrifying efficiency. They had perhaps a 2-minute head start before mounted warriors would overtake them. 2 minutes to cover ground and find somewhere to hide, or some way to slow the pursuit. The terrain was rocky and uneven, treacherous to navigate at night, even with the starlight to guide them. Thomas led Naicha toward a section he'd scouted earlier, a series of narrow ravines that would be difficult for horses to navigate. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. They plunged into the ravine system, using their hands as much as their feet to scramble over rocks and through tight passages. Behind them, the first mounted warriors were arriving at the ravine entrance, the sound of horses pulling up short as their riders assessed whether to pursue on foot or try to circle around. "Keep moving," Thomas urged, helping Naicha over a particularly difficult boulder. She was breathing hard, clearly in pain, but she didn't slow down or complain. Whatever they'd done to her during the interrogation, it hadn't broken her will. The ravine system was a maze of interconnected passages, some leading deeper into the canyon system while others dead-ended at sheer walls. Thomas had memorized the basic layout during his afternoon observation, but navigating it in darkness while being pursued was entirely different from planning routes from a safe distance. They took a left branch, then a right, then crawled through a gap barely wide enough for their bodies. Thomas could hear warriors behind them, spread out and searching, calling to each other to coordinate their efforts. The Apache knew this terrain far better than he did, and it was only a matter of time before they cut off all the escape routes. "There!" Naiche grabbed his arm and pointed to a dark opening in the ravine wall, barely visible in the shadows. "Cave system, goes deep, multiple passages. We can lose them there." Thomas didn't hesitate. They scrambled toward the cave entrance and plunged inside just as torchlight appeared in the ravine behind them. He heard warriors shouting, announcing they'd found tracks leading to the cave. The pursuit was about to move underground. Inside the cave, the darkness was absolute. Thomas felt along the walls with his hands. Naicha doing the same on the opposite side. They moved as quietly as possible, putting distance between themselves and the entrance while trying not to make sounds that would give away their exact position. "There's a fork ahead," Naicha whispered. "Left passage goes to a dead end. Right passage leads to the deep system, but it's dangerous. Vertical drops, tight spaces, underground water. People have died there. Which way do we go?" "Left. Let them think we went right." Thomas understood the strategy immediately. They moved into the left passage and felt their way to the back, finding a wide chamber with some kind of natural rock formations. Nietzsche pulled him behind one of the larger formations, and they pressed themselves against the cold stone, waiting in absolute silence. Torchlight flickered at the cave entrance, growing brighter as warriors entered. Thomas counted at least 6 of them from the voices, possibly more. They were being cautious, aware that a cornered enemy could be dangerous even when outnumbered. The warriors reached the fork and paused, discussing something in Apache. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested debate about which direction to pursue. Then one of them spoke with authority. A decision had been made. Footsteps moved past the left passage and down the right one into the deep system. Thomas and Nietzsche remained frozen behind the rock formation, barely breathing. Not all the warriors had gone right. He could still hear at least 2 of them near the fork, probably stationed there to prevent escape back the way they'd come. They were trapped in a dead-end passage with guards blocking the only exit. Minutes passed in tense silence. Thomas's legs were cramping from the awkward position, and he could feel Nietzsche trembling against him. Whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Probably all 3. They couldn't stay here indefinitely, but they also couldn't leave with guards watching the fork. Then they heard something that changed everything. A distant cry from deep in the right passage, followed by a rumbling sound that made the entire cave system vibrate. The warriors at the fork shouted to each other, then ran toward the right passage, their footsteps receding rapidly. "Collapse," Nietzsche whispered. "The deep system is unstable. Someone went too far, put weight on the wrong rock. The whole section just came down. Will they be able to get out? Some of them, maybe, but they'll be focused on rescue now, not pursuit. This is our chance." They moved quickly back to the fork, then passed it toward the cave entrance. Thomas expected to encounter more guards, but the entrance was clear. Everyone had either gone into the deep system to help with the rescue or was outside organizing the effort. The cave opening framed a view of chaos. Warriors running back and forth, someone shouting orders, torches everywhere. "We can't go out there," Thomas said. "Too exposed." "Not out. Up." Nietzsche pointed to a narrow ledge that ran along the cave wall above the entrance. "Climbs to the surface about 40 feet up. They won't be looking for us above them." Thomas looked at the ledge dubiously. It was barely 6 inches wide in places, with a sheer drop to sharp rocks below. Attempting it in darkness, while exhausted and injured, seemed suicidal. Then again, so did staying in the cave or trying to slip past the organized search outside. "You first," he said. "I'll catch you if you fall. You can't catch me from below. Then I'll break your fall. Same thing." Nietzsche managed a weak smile at that, then began climbing. She moved slowly but confidently, finding handholds in the rock face that Thomas could barely see. He followed close behind, acutely aware that one slip would send him plummeting onto the rocks below. His arms were shaking with fatigue and his fingers were raw from gripping sharp stones. They climbed in silence, the chaos at the cave entrance continuing below them. Someone had organized a proper rescue effort for the warriors trapped by the collapse, which meant most of the camp's attention was focused inward on the disaster rather than outward on the escaped prisoner. The ledge finally ended at a small opening that led to the surface. Nightjay squeezed through it, and Thomas followed, emerging onto a flat area covered in scrub brush. They were on top of the ridge that overlooked the camp, and almost the exact spot where Thomas had hidden earlier that afternoon. Below them, the camp was fully illuminated by torches as warriors worked to rescue their trapped companions. No one was looking up toward the ridgeline. For the moment, they were invisible. "We need to keep moving," Thomas said quietly. "Once they realize we're not in the cave system, they'll expand the search." "I know, but Thomas..." Naiche turned to face him, and in the starlight he could see the extent of the damage they'd done to her during interrogation. Her face was bruised and swollen, one eye nearly closed, her lips split. "Why did you come back? You were free. You could have made it to your fort. You saved my life. Then you sacrificed yourself to complete a mission I helped you start. I couldn't just walk away from that." "Most men would have. Then I guess I'm not like most men." Naiche studied him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak but determined. "My brother Taza, he gave you something for me. I saw you put it in your belt before we ran." Thomas had almost forgotten about the knife. He pulled it from his belt and handed it to her. He said you would understand what it meant. Naiche took the knife, her expression unreadable in the darkness. She turned it over in her hands, examining it carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "This was Delgado's knife. My brother is telling me that he understands why I helped Marcus Brennan escape, that he approves, that he knows the difference between justice and vengeance. He also said to tell you that Delgado's greatest revenge is watching your father descend into cruelty that dishonors his son's memory." Taza always was the philosophical one. Naiche slipped the knife into her own belt. "Come. I know a place where we can hide until dawn, then make our way north. It's not safe yet. They'll be hunting us for days. But we have a chance now, which is more than I had an hour ago." They moved along the ridgeline, staying low and using every bit of cover available. Behind them, the camp continued its rescue operation, warriors working by torchlight to clear the collapsed passage. Thomas wondered how many had been trapped, whether any had died. He wondered if Cochita was down there helping, or if he was already organizing search parties to recapture his escaped prisoner. He wondered how long their luck could possibly hold before it ran out entirely. "Thomas Caldwell," Naiche said as they walked, her voice quiet but clear. "You asked me once why I would help you, a stranger. I told you it was because you didn't lie when I asked about fairness, because the traders said you kept your word. Do you remember?" "I remember. I didn't tell you the real reason. The real reason is that I saw something in you that I recognized. Someone who was trying to stay neutral in a war because taking sides meant accepting that sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones. Someone who wanted to believe that fairness and profit could coexist, that you could do business with everyone and betray no one." She paused, turning to look at him. "But you can't. Eventually, everyone has to choose what they stand for. You chose tonight, when you came back for me. You chose mercy over safety, honor over survival. That choice may cost you your life, but it also makes you someone worth saving." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They walked on through the darkness. two fugitives in a hostile land, heading toward an uncertain future with nothing but each other, and the slim hope that somehow, against all odds, they might actually survive what they'd started. Behind them, the sounds of the rescue operation continued. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent to the small human dramas being played out in the desert below. And ahead of them, somewhere in the darkness, lay either salvation or death. They'd find out which soon enough. For now, they just kept walking. They walked through the night until Naicha's legs finally gave out. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently to sit against a large boulder. They'd covered maybe 4 miles from the camp, moving through terrain that seemed designed specifically to punish human passage. Every step had been a negotiation with sharp rocks, thorny plants, and loose gravel that threatened to send them tumbling down slopes in the darkness. "I need to rest," Naicha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a few minutes." Thomas knew that stopping was dangerous. The warriors would be searching for them as soon as they'd finished dealing with the cave collapse. But he also knew that Naiche was running on empty, her body pushed far beyond its limits by the interrogation, the beating, and now hours of desperate flight. If they didn't rest, she'd collapse completely, and then they'd have no chance at all. "We'll stop here until first light," he said, scanning the area for defensible positions. There was an overhang about 20 yards away that would provide some shelter and concealment. "Can you make it to that rock formation?" She nodded, and he helped her stand. They made their way to the overhang, and Thomas arranged their position so they'd have a view of anyone approaching from the direction of the camp. It wasn't much, but it was better than being caught in the open. Naiche leaned back against the rock, her breathing labored. In the faint starlight, Thomas could see that her injuries were worse than he'd initially thought. The swelling on her face had increased, and she was favoring her left side in a way that suggested broken or cracked ribs. "Let me look at your injuries," he said. "There's nothing you can do about them out here. Save your energy." "Let me look anyway." She relented, and Thomas examined her as carefully as he could in the darkness. The facial injuries were painful, but not life-threatening. The ribs were more concerning. If one of them had punctured a lung, she could be bleeding internally and there would be nothing he could do about it. But her breathing seemed relatively normal, just pained, which suggested the ribs were cracked rather than completely broken. "You need a doctor," he said finally. "I need to survive until morning. Doctors can wait." Naiche closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at him directly. "Tell me about Sarah Dutton." The question caught Thomas off guard. "What?" "The woman at Fort Benson. The one you asked me to tell you about what happened if you died. Tell me about her." Thomas settled back against the rock, considering how to answer. "She runs the general store at the fort. Came out from Boston about 3 years ago after her husband died. Everyone expected her to sell the store and go back east, but she stayed. She's stubborn like that." "And she means something to you?" It wasn't a question. Thomas found himself nodding anyway. "She's the closest thing I have to family out here. We play chess on Sunday evenings when I'm in town. She makes terrible coffee and excellent arguments about politics and morality. She's been trying to convince me for 2 years that neutrality is impossible in a place like this." She was right. Yeah, she usually is. Thomas looked out into the darkness, thinking about Sarah's face the last time they'd argued about his refusal to take sides in the conflicts tearing the territory apart. She'll probably say, "I told you so," if I make it back alive. "Do you love her?" The directness of the question made Thomas pause. Did he love Sarah Dutton? He'd never really examined his feelings that carefully, had always told himself they were just friends who enjoyed each other's company. But if he was being honest, really honest, the kind of honest you could only be when you might die before sunrise, then yes, he probably did love her. He just hadn't had the courage to do anything about it. "I think so," he said finally. "I've been afraid to find out for sure." Why? Because loving someone means giving them power to hurt you, means making yourself vulnerable. I've spent 5 years building a life based on independence and self-sufficiency. Letting someone in threatens all of that. Naicha made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. You think loving someone makes you weak. But tonight, you risked everything to save a woman you barely know, simply because it was the right thing to do. That's not a weakness, Thomas Caldwell. That's the strongest thing a person can be. Or the stupidest. Sometimes they're the same thing. She shifted position, wincing at the pain in her ribs. I loved someone once, a warrior named Goyakla. He was brave and kind, and he made me laugh even when there was nothing to laugh about. We were going to be married. Thomas heard the past tense and understood. What happened? The soldiers happened. There was a raid on our camp 3 years ago. Goyakla was killed defending the women and children. He bought us time to escape, but he paid for it with his life. Her voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the old grief underneath. That was the day Marcus Brennan pulled me from the river. I'd been running from the soldiers, not watching where I was going, and I fell into the floodwaters. Marcus was camped nearby. He jumped in and pulled me out, even though he could have been killed himself if the soldiers had found him helping an Apache woman. So you owed him a debt. More than that, he gave me back my life when I thought I had nothing left to live for. After Goyakla died, I wanted to die too. But Marcus saved me, and then he told me something I've never forgotten. She paused, gathering the memory. He said that the people who love us never really want us to die with them. They want us to live, and to honor their memory by living well. He said the best way to respect the dead is to refuse to become like them. Thomas thought about that, about what it meant to live in a way that honored the dead rather than simply mourning them. Is that why you helped him escape? To repay the debt? Partly, but also because I knew that Delgado's death was an accident, not murder. The boy was young and eager to prove himself. He attacked Marcus's camp without orders, without backup, without even verifying that Marcus was the enemy he thought he was. Marcus defended himself, and Delgado died. It was tragic, but it wasn't murder. She touched the knife Taza had given her, the one that had belonged to Delgado. Cocheta couldn't see that through his grief. He wanted blood, wanted revenge. He was willing to torture a man to death to satisfy his need for vengeance. I couldn't let that happen. Even though it meant betraying your own people. I didn't betray my people. I honored what my people are supposed to stand for. Justice, not vengeance. Wisdom, not blind rage. Cocheta is the one who betrayed us by letting his grief turn him into something ugly. Her expression hardened. My brother Taza understands this. So does my mother, which is why she argued for mercy during the trial. But Cocheta's rage has infected too many others. They see only the death of a young warrior and the escape of his killer. They don't see the larger truth. Dawn was beginning to break on the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Thomas knew they needed to move soon. Daylight would make them visible to any search parties, but it would also make navigation easier and faster. The question was whether Naiche could keep moving, and how far they could get before the pursuit caught up. As if reading his thoughts, Naicha struggled to her feet. "We need to go. The warriors will be searching in full force once there's enough light to track by." They set out again, moving northeast toward the distant line of hills that would eventually lead to the northern trail. The terrain was slightly easier in daylight, but it also meant they were exposed. Thomas kept scanning the landscape for signs of pursuit, expecting at any moment to see dust clouds or mounted warriors on the horizon. By mid-morning, they'd covered another 3 miles, but Nietzsche was flagging badly. She was trying to hide it, but Thomas could see she was struggling with every step. They needed water, food, and medical attention, none of which were available in this barren stretch of desert. "There's a settler's cabin about 5 miles northeast," Thomas said, studying the terrain and trying to remember the maps he'd studied over the years. "Old man named Garrett lives there with his wife. They're good people, might help us. Might also turn us in to the soldiers, or the Apache, depending on who offers more for us. It's a risk, but we need water, and you need rest. We won't make it to Fort Benson without help." Naicha nodded reluctantly, and they adjusted their course toward where Thomas remembered the cabin being. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert and making every step feel like wading through thick mud. Thomas's mouth was dry as sand, and he knew Nietzsche had to be even worse off given her injuries and the interrogation she'd endured. They crested a low rise around noon, and Thomas spotted the cabin in the distance, a small structure made of logs and adobe with a corral and a few scraggly animals. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which meant someone was home. "Wait here," Thomas said. "Let me approach alone first, make sure they're friendly. If they're not friendly, you'll be captured or killed. If they're not friendly and we both approach, we'll both be captured or killed. This way, at least one of us has a chance." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Trust me, I haven't gotten us killed yet." Yet being the important word. Thomas managed a tired smile and began making his way down the slope toward the cabin. He kept his hands visible and his rifle slung across his back in a non-threatening position. As he approached, the door opened and an older man stepped out, holding a shotgun at a ready but not quite aimed position. "That's close enough, stranger," the man called. "State your business." "My name is Thomas Caldwell. I'm a freight hauler out of Fort Benson. I'm traveling with an injured companion, and we need water and a place to rest for a few hours. I can pay." The man studied him for a long moment. "Thomas Caldwell. Heard of you. Folks say you're an honest dealer, though there's also talk you've been helping Apache fugitives escape justice. That true?" Thomas decided honesty was the only play. "I helped a woman escape from warriors who were going to execute her at dawn. She didn't deserve to die. If that makes me a fugitive helper, then I guess that's what I am." "This woman, she Apache?" "Yes. And she's with you now?" "Hidden on the ridge. She's injured and needs medical attention." The older man lowered his shotgun slightly and called back toward the cabin. "Martha, we got company." Then, to Thomas, "Name's Robert Garrett. This is our land, such as it is. Been here 15 years. Seen about every kind of trouble this territory can produce. Apache woman who doesn't deserve to die sounds like a story worth hearing. Bring her down, and we'll see about that water and rest." Thomas felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying to ease. He signaled to Naicha, who emerged from her hiding spot and began making her way down the slope. She was limping more heavily now, and Thomas could see that her strength was almost completely exhausted. A woman appeared in the cabin doorway. presumably Martha Garrett. She was in her 60s, with steel gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades under the desert sun. When she saw Nietzsche's condition, her expression shifted from wariness to concern. "Robert, stop standing there like a fool and help that girl inside. She looks half dead." The next hour was a blur of activity. Martha Garrett took charge of Nietzsche's care with the efficient competence of someone who'd dealt with injuries before. She cleaned and bandaged the facial wounds, felt the ribs carefully and determined they were cracked but not broken completely, and made Nietzsche drink water slowly to avoid shocking her system. Thomas sat at the rough wooden table and answered Robert Garrett's questions: where they'd come from, what had happened, why warriors were hunting them. He left out some details but gave the essential truth. Nietzsche had helped a fugitive escape. Thomas had helped her escape, and now they were both marked for death if captured. "You've stepped in it proper," Robert said when Thomas finished. "Cocheta's one of the most respected war chiefs in the territory. Crossing him is signing your own death warrant." "I know, but it was the right thing to do." Right thing and smart thing ain't always the same. Robert refilled Thomas's water cup. "But I respect a man who does what he thinks is right even when it costs him. Martha and I will give you food and water for the road, let you rest a few hours. But you can't stay long. If warriors come looking and find you here, they'll burn this place to the ground with us in it." "I understand, and thank you." They rested for 3 hours, Nietzsche sleeping fitfully while Martha applied some kind of herbal poultice to her injuries. Thomas dozed in a chair, his rifle across his lap, jerking awake at every sound. When Martha finally woke them, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "She needs more rest," Martha said quietly, "but you can't get it here. Those ribs need to be properly bound, and she needs real medicine. Best I can do is tell you the fastest route to Fort Benson and give you supplies for the journey." They left the Garrett cabin as the sun touched the horizon, carrying bags of food and water that Robert had insisted they take, despite Thomas's protests about payment. "Pay me by surviving," Robert had said, "and if you see Sarah Dutton at the fort, tell her the Garretts send their regards." The comment had surprised Thomas until Robert explained that Sarah had helped Martha get medicine for an infected wound 2 years ago, had argued with the fort commander until he released the supplies. "She's a good woman," Robert said. "Stubborn as hell, but good. You could do worse than settling down with someone like that." Now they were walking through the twilight, following the route Robert had described. Fort Benson was still 2 days away, maybe 3 given Nietzsche's condition. The warriors would be searching, and there was no guarantee they'd make it. But they had a chance now, which was more than they'd had this morning. "Thomas," Nietzsche said as they walked, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I really chose to trust you." "What do you mean?" "When I found you yesterday morning, I'd been tracking you for 2 days. Not just watching, actively tracking. I knew you were in the area, and I knew the warriors were closing in. I could have simply avoided you, let you get caught in the search and use that as a distraction for Marcus Brennan's escape." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "But you didn't." "No, because I watched you for those 2 days, saw how you moved through the territory. You were careful not to damage the land. You left food for desert animals. You spoke respectfully to yourself about the places you passed through. Small things, but they told me you saw this land as something to be respected, not just conquered." She paused, then continued. "And then I saw you notice the warriors and immediately think about how to avoid them, rather than confront them. Most white men would have either run in panic or prepared to fight. You did neither. You calculated, you planned, you looked for the smart choice rather than the proud one. I'm not sure what you're saying. I'm saying I chose you, Thomas Caldwell. Not randomly, not because you were convenient. I chose you specifically because I saw in you someone who might understand that mercy is not weakness, that intelligence is not cowardice, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to fight. She stopped walking and turned to face him. When I whispered, "I choose you," yesterday, I meant it in ways you didn't understand then. I was choosing you to trust with my life, with Marcus Brennan's life, with the hope that maybe one white man proving that Apache and settlers can show each other mercy might matter someday. Thomas looked at her, bruised and battered but still defiant, still believing that individual choices could matter in the face of overwhelming violence and hatred. He thought about how many times over the past 2 days he could have made different choices, safer choices, and how each time he'd chosen to honor the trust she'd placed in him. "I choose you, too," he said quietly. "I don't know if it matters in the big picture. Don't know if one freight hauler and one Apache woman surviving this mess will change anything about the wars tearing this territory apart. But you're alive, and I'm alive, and maybe that's enough for now." Nietzsche smiled. A real smile this time, despite the split lip and the pain. "Maybe it is." They walked on through the darkness, two people from different worlds who'd found common ground in the simple act of choosing to see each other as human beings worthy of trust and sacrifice. Behind them, somewhere in the desert, warriors were still searching. Ahead of them, Fort Benson waited with all its complications and Sarah Dutton's probably justified, "I told you so." But in this moment, walking through the star-filled night with someone who'd trusted him enough to risk everything, Thomas Caldwell felt something he hadn't felt in years. I felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. 3 days later, they stumbled into Fort Benson just after dawn. Naicha was barely conscious, supported entirely by Thomas's arm around her waist. The gate guards raised their rifles in alarm at seeing an Apache woman, but Thomas's shouted identification as a known freight hauler made them hesitate just long enough for him to get inside the walls. Sarah Dutton was one of the first people to reach them, her yellow hair flying loose as she ran from the general store. She took one look at Naicha's condition and immediately began giving orders to the soldiers standing around uselessly. "Don't just stand there. Get the fort doctor, and someone find clean water and bandages." She turned to Thomas, her expression a mix of relief and fury. "Thomas Caldwell, you look like death warmed over, and you have about 5 seconds to explain why you're bringing an Apache woman into this fort before the commander decides to arrest you both." "It's a long story," Thomas said, feeling his legs starting to give out now that they'd finally reached safety. "Then you'd better start telling it quickly." Sarah moved to help support Naicha's other side, taking some of the weight off Thomas. "And Thomas, for the record, I told you that neutrality was impossible and eventually you'd have to choose a side. I hate being right about things like this. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the pain, the very real possibility that he'd just destroyed his entire life to save a woman he'd known for 3 days, Thomas found himself laughing. "Yeah, Sarah, you were right. You're always right. Can we argue about it later, after we've slept for about a week? We can argue about it for the next year if that's what it takes to get through your thick skull." But she was smiling as she said it, and when their eyes met over Nietzsche's slumped form, Thomas saw something there that made him think maybe, just maybe, surviving this disaster might be worth it after all. The fort doctor arrived and took charge of Nietzsche, hustling her away to the medical building. The commander appeared, demanding explanations, and Thomas found himself telling the story once again, edited for military ears, but essentially truthful. Nietzsche had been unjustly condemned. He'd helped her escape, and now they were both seeking sanctuary. The commander was not pleased. "You've created a diplomatic incident, Caldwell. Cocheta will come looking for her, and when he does, he'll expect us to turn her over. Then you'll have to tell him no," Thomas said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Because she's under my protection, and I'm a citizen requesting shelter within these walls. Unless you've started the practice of handing over people to be tortured and executed just because someone demands it." Sarah stepped forward then, her expression determined. "And I'll add that if the fort starts surrendering people who've committed no crime except helping someone escape unjust punishment, then I'll be writing letters to every newspaper between here and Washington explaining exactly what kind of command this is. You know I will, Commander." The commander looked between them, clearly calculating the political ramifications. Finally, he sighed. "She can stay in the medical facility until she's recovered enough to travel. After that, she'll need to leave the fort. I won't turn her over to Cocheta, but I also won't harbor her indefinitely. That's the best I can do." It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Thomas nodded his acceptance, then finally allowed himself to collapse into the chair someone had brought. Sarah sat beside him, her hand finding his, and they stayed that way while the fort buzzed with activity around them. "You know this isn't over," Sarah said quietly. "Cocheta will want revenge. The warriors will remember. This could follow you for the rest of your life. I know. And you did it. Anyway." "I did it anyway." She squeezed his hand. "Then I guess that settles the question of what kind of man you are, Thomas Caldwell. Took you long enough to figure it out." He squeezed back, too tired for words but not too tired to understand that something fundamental had changed in him over the past 3 days. He'd started this journey as a man trying to stay neutral, trying to profit without taking sides, trying to avoid the messy moral calculations that came with choosing principles over pragmatism. He'd ended it as someone different, someone who understood that neutrality was its own choice, and often the wrong one. Someone who knew that sometimes keeping your word meant risking everything. Someone who'd looked into an Apache woman's eyes and whispered back the words that defined them both. "I choose you." In the medical building, Nietzsche was sleeping under the doctor's care, Delgado's knife hidden beneath her pillow. A reminder that honor sometimes required sacrifice, that justice was different from vengeance, that the bravest thing anyone could do was choose mercy when the world demanded blood. And outside the fort walls, the desert stretched away in all directions, indifferent to human drama, ancient and unchanging beneath the rising sun. Somewhere out there, warriors were still searching. Somewhere out there, Marcus Brennan was building a new life with the second chance Nietzsche had given him. Somewhere out there the wars would continue, the conflicts would rage on, the territory would keep demanding that people choose sides. But here, in this moment, in this place, two people had chosen each other. They'd chosen trust over suspicion, mercy over vengeance, courage over safety. And if that choice didn't change the world, if it didn't stop the wars or heal the hatred, well, maybe it didn't have to. Maybe it was enough that it had changed them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.